Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Welcome back to the Savvy Dentist podcast, the show where great dentistry meets great business. It's Jesse Green here at the control panels, and we are having a conversation about lessons learned since business school. I'm joined today by Rael Bricker, who is eminently qualified. He's got a couple of master's degrees, Masters of Engineering, Masters of Business. He's got a finance broking business. He's been there and done it all. Now, before we get into that conversation about lessons he's learned since business school, just want to share a couple of public service announcements. For our new listeners, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you here. For our older listeners, welcome back. It's wonderful to have you guys here as well. If you have not yet found our Facebook group, the Savvy Dentist Facebook group, please head across to drjessegreen.com/Facebook and you can find us there. It's a free group for dentists only, and it's got tools, checklists, cheat sheets, everything you need to create a practice and a life that you love. In addition to that, you might want to download the Savvy Dentist app. It's a free app. You can head across to your favorite app store, whether it's the Apple App Store or indeed the Google Play Store if you're an Android user. Again, free resource, tons of content there, and I hope you find that really helpful and really useful as you go on your quest to build a business that you love. Now, my guest today, Rael Bricker, as I mentioned, he's got a couple of master's degrees. He's run businesses for many, many years, and he's written the book called Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School. I think it's a wonderful read. I've read it, and it's got some intriguing pieces of wisdom in there, which I'm very keen to explore. Rael, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse, and good morning.
Mate, I wanted to ask you the title of your book, Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School. Before we get into what's in the book, I'm curious to ask, what did you learn before business school? What were the things that you thought, wow, this is the way it is? And then obviously since business school, you might have rethought a few things.
Oh, I did. And I guess I did my MBA in 1988, which dates me a little bit. But going into it, we all believed that the MBA was the nuts and bolts of everything you needed to know about business. I guess I came out of the MBA with an understanding that the MBA was nothing more than an exposure to a whole lot of aspects of business that I didn't know about as an engineer, but I had an interest in. And so I often tell a story on stage when I'm speaking to corporates and conferences about what really started my quest to understand business. And that was before I did the MBA. In fact, the year before I did the MBA. And if you have about a minute and a half, I will tell the story very quickly.
Go for it.
I was a 22-year-old engineer working for a little company in South Africa called Anglo American, which, for those who are not familiar with it, is the equivalent of a BHP or a Rio Tinto in terms of mining house. I was working on a project some 4 hours out of Johannesburg. And the first time I had to go up to that project, I was told to go to the private hangar at what was then Jan Smuts Airport, now Johannesburg International. So I arrived at the private hangar in my mustard-colored Mazda 616 with 180,000 kilometers on the clock, in an open neck shirt and jeans because I was going to a mine site. Suddenly, all my fellow travelers arrived, chauffeur-driven, in their fitted, custom-made suits, Italian shoes, and I felt a little bit out of place. So I got on the plane. It happened to be a Citation jet, got into the back row and sat down. Once we'd taken off and the pilot said, okay, you can move around now, on the floor next to me was an esky. And so I opened the esky and I was about to offer drinks to everyone on the plane when I got this tap on my shoulder. And thankfully, it wasn't the hand of God because we're in an airplane. It was the hand of the most senior director of Anglo American, who said to me, please don't do that. And I said, no problem. I'm the youngest and fittest and whatever. He said, no, on our planes, the most senior person has to serve the drinks, not the most junior. Now, I worked in an organization where I was a C4 level engineer. That meant I parked in the third parking lot away from the head office. If I was a D1 engineer, I parked in the second parking lot closest to the office. But suddenly on the plane, there was this absolute countercultural, everything was turned on its head. And so I knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel. I knew that even in this highly structured, siloed organization, the fact that they could turn culture on its head within the confines of its plane meant that in the future, culture would become a critical element of business. And so that was long before I started at business school. That was a year before business school. But it started my quest to understand business and everything that drives business. And over those 30 years, I've now come to the conclusion that culture is one of the cornerstones. And I've been doing a lot of work in that culture space. But that story, that idea really started the lessons before I went to business school.
So that's really interesting. So even as a young buck at 22, having that experience on the plane where the most senior person is the person who serves the drinks. I'm curious to ask you, obviously that set you on a journey of learning and curiosity. How did you feel at that time? What was your emotional reaction at that particular point? Was there an emotional reaction?
Yeah, there was, because a step back 18 months prior to that, when I was working out on the mine sites near Johannesburg, my biggest frustration at the time was that I wanted to understand how the job I was doing fitted into the greater success of the whole mine. Now, that might have been a bit overambitious as a young junior engineer, but that was always my driver. I really wanted to know how all these pieces of the puzzle, how the cogs fitted together that made this machine function. And so the emotion then was one of, okay, there's actually a light. Maybe these people who are right at the top of the hierarchy are actually human after all. And maybe there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And so I guess that was what it was for me. I mean, one of the other principles I speak about in the book is never asking staff to do anything that you wouldn't do. And as trivial as that sounds, that was a lesson learned from that aeroplane.
It's really interesting because, and I'll come back to that point because I'd like to pick up that thread because I think it's an interesting conversation. But just to talk a bit about your work with culture at the moment, I think culture is obviously a very topical subject at the moment. There's lots of conversations around it. And I think it's one of those things that we all know is important. We all get it. But one of the things that when I talk to business owners is they think, okay, I understand I've got to have a great culture, but how do I create it with a degree of intention? How do I create it in a way that's going to serve the business without feeling contrived, but it's authentic and intentional? So I guess my question for you, Rael, is for someone listening to this show and they thought, okay, I understand the importance of culture. I understand that culture kind of exists a bit like the air around us, but I also know I've got to put some effort and energy into it. What sort of things would you be suggesting that someone listening to this podcast start thinking about, or indeed learning or mastering? What sort of things would they start with?
Okay, well, again, let me paraphrase that, I guess. So about 18 months ago, before my book was published, I met with a mentor of mine in the speaking space. And we got talking for a few hours, and he turned around to me and he said, you know what, your passion is culture. And I said, well, that's interesting, because I've actually got 2 chapters in the book that kind of deal with culture. And he said, yes, but what you need to do now is to really add value to your clients, is go out and take your experience outside of South Africa and outside of Australia and find out what's happening in the rest of the world. He said, but don't do it by sitting on Google. And so there was one of the famous books that said, and there was a line in there that I always quote that said, Google is not a synonym for research. So what I did is I actually took that to heart. And as at last week, I have conducted 77 interviews over 25 different countries so far.
Wow.
And my 78th interview is later this week. And really, the companies have ranged from 10 staff to 90,000 on a global scale. And so what I've got from those companies is perspectives on their cultures. Now, not everyone who spoke to me was happy with their culture. A lot of them felt they had toxic cultures. And so what I've gleaned out of that and the advice and the story and what I speak to companies about on a consulting level is 3 things. One is you need to be able to measure your culture, and we can come back to that later. We have tools that allow you to actually measure culture as a non-financial performance indicator. But more importantly, the successful companies had two characteristics, and not always both. They had one or the other.
Yeah.
They either had a purpose, and a purpose in a broad sense. To define corporate purpose is not the mission and vision statement, something greater than that. But the purpose deals with the relationship with the company and stakeholders, external people to the company. That's what a purpose really does. But it's a purpose that everyone from the CEO to the janitor can buy into.
Yeah.
The second aspect is that a lot of successful companies may not have had a purpose statement that was greater than themselves, but they had a set of values that were easy to understand, easy to remember, and again, that everyone on the team, from the CEO to the janitor, could buy into. Now, the value set, when you look at values, for them to be true values, they're internal. They are how the team relates to each other, how the team relate to things like culture and ethics, and how they relate to the brand, etc. But it's all internal, and purpose is external. And the most successful companies have both purpose and values. In other words, the external and the internal. Whereas I'd say of the 77 interviews, probably half had a set of values. Half of the successful companies had a set of values, and half had a purpose statement. Very few had both.
I think that's phenomenal. Again, I love the fact that some are external and outward looking and others are more internally focused. I wanted to ask you, just coming back to your point around measuring culture and the process by which you might do it. How do you actually do that? What's the metric around that, or what's the process of measuring?
There are two tools that I use. The one is called PGI, a performance gap indicator, which really gives you 5 measures of non-financial key performance indicators for the business. And one of those is culture. And that's based around a set of 60 or so questions where the participants, and so you choose how far down in the organization you go, or you do it at, a 10% of each organizational level, as much as I dislike highly structured organizations. But then you measure the responses of the team members anonymously, but then you can also measure it by department, by gender, by tenure in the organization, to see if people with lesser tenure have a different view of the culture to those with a long tenure, etc. And that really gives you a performance gap. So it measures against an ideal set of responses and gives you the gap between the ideal set of responses and where your team members are judging the organization. That's the PGI, which is a tool in and of itself. We produce a 30-odd page report at the end of it, which really looks in detail at each of the gaps.
Okay.
The second tool is a more free-flowing. It's also about 60 questions, but it's really about 30 graded questions where there's a scaled answer, and about 30 open-ended questions. Questions like, the corporate values in my own words are. And so it's really delving a little deeper into people's understanding of where the business or the organization is going, and allowing them to express it a bit more freely in terms of open-ended questions.
And does that translate to smaller enterprises as well as neatly? Because I'm listening to you talk about the PGI, and we're looking at 10% of different organizational
I said
segments.
10 because it could be, I've done it for a company of 14 staff where I've done all 14 staff.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so it does translate.
So it translates into any number. It's just because, a lot of companies want to do a random sample across 1,000 staff and want to get 100 staff responding to the survey.
Yeah, got it. All right, well, let's fast forward a little bit, because over the years, you've spent a lot of time underground in mines. You've spent lots of hours, I imagine, as an engineer focusing on those sorts of elements of the job. And you mentioned to me a moment ago, as we spoke about it, as a young engineer, you wanted to know exactly what your role was and how it contributed to the greater good of the company. What I wanted to ask you just very briefly was, when you're underground I imagine there's a lot going on underground, and I'm not a miner. I've not spent time in an underground mine. What did you learn about yourself being underground?
It's interesting that I actually probably learned more when I reflected on it years later than at the time I was physically there.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, part of the challenge in South Africa, this was South Africa in the 80s,
apartheid, and
pre the release of Nelson Mandela, pre the democratic government, pre the first democratic elections in 94, where particularly in the mining sector or any heavy industrial sector, there was still very, very strong elements of apartheid. And so, the fact that I spoke the vernacular language, which was called Fanagalo at the time, which was a combination of a number of the vernacular languages combined with a bit of Afrikaans and a few other languages mixed in, but it was the language of the mines, allowed me to communicate. I was often looked at a bit strangely by a number of my colleagues because I actually communicated with the staff of color on trying to find out, how are you? Where are you from? Where are your kids? Where is your wife? Because the mining sector at the time was very driven by men coming from the rural areas and living in hostels on the mines. The shaft that I worked at, 9 shaft at Vaal Reefs, had somewhere around 5,000 staff laborers on the shaft.
Wow.
And all of whom lived in hostels. What I learned about myself, I learned about myself that I knew I would never be absolutely tied to the hierarchy. I had far too much ambition to sit and wait for my promotions. But I also learned that if you just treated people with respect and you didn't show disdain to people and you were prepared to help them when they were doing something wrong, they would show you the same respect. And as I was 22 at the time, or 21 when I started there, and a lot of the staff there had been there for 10 or 15 or 20 years before. And by admitting that you don't know something is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of humanity. And if you admit that you don't know something and you ask people for help, they're happy to help you.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people feel that they have to show their boss, the ego gets in the way, and then they don't do the right thing.
I can't help but think that those early days have set you up for that working culture, valuing in the individuals, showing respect. I suspect that all of those learnings show up in your work now. I want to talk a bit about your book, Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School, because I think it's a fabulous book. And firstly, congratulations on getting it done. I know how hard it is to write a book. We spoke a little bit off air about the process, clarifying the thought processes. So again, well done. I think it's a tremendous read. I do want to just focus a couple of little areas on the book because I've made a few little notes, and I know you're not meant to dog ear books, but I did just to use it as a resource. I'm a bit of a believer. When I was a kid, my mum worked in the library at school and books were treated with almost gloved hands. But these days I use them as a resource, so I tend to be one of those people that, turns the ear of the book over or whatever. So it's not as pristine as it was when it arrived. But I wanted to ask you, the premise of the work that I do with dentists is really about transitioning from self-employment to true business ownership. And you've got a wonderful chapter here, chapter 4, which is about give up control to gain control. And my observation with most dentists, and I can say this as someone who is in that profession as well, that we all like to have high degrees of control. It's what we're trained to do. There's high degrees of precision, perfectionism, all those sorts of things. And yet, from a business perspective, having that control helps us to a point, but it also allows us to hit a ceiling and we can't get past it unless we give up control. So I wanted to ask you about your experiences in giving up control, what lessons you learned as you gave up control, what headaches or problems you might have encountered in that journey, and how you got through it.
Interestingly, that was, as I mentioned off air, the original working title of my book was always Give Up Control to Gain Control. But when we sat down and looked at it, it was only one chapter, although it's been a guiding principle in a lot of things I do. In our mortgage business, we had been running for a couple of years, and like a lot of one-man shows, I started that business out of my lounge room in 2001. By 2003, I had offices and 18 brokers working for me. And I went out and I had a particular recruitment model for those brokers, which was young commerce graduates, and I thought I could teach them how to sell mortgages, but I wanted them to be strong in finance. So that was my criteria for employing them.
Yep.
But what I found was that there was an inefficiency in that system, and that was the prevailing idea at the time. Prevailing idea was you put lots and lots of brokers on your team, and if each one of them goes and does $1 million a month, well, then you're doing well.
Mm-hmm.
I found that the biggest problem that they had, and I still had, was I was still processing every loan that I was doing for every client.
All right.
And those days, it was a little different to today. I think the pendulum has swung, but in those days, everything was done by fax. So you had to collate all the paperwork. If they had pay slips that were A5, you had to sit the photocopier, copy them so they were on A4, then be able to fax them all through to a bank. And we're talking of a 100-page fax. Fax machines didn't cope with 100 pages in those days. So it was a whole long technical process to actually submit a loan on behalf of a client.
Mm-hmm.
The revelation I had was when myself and my partner at the time decided to employ our first assistant.
Mm-hmm.
We had no idea how we would train this assistant. We had no idea how we would delegate authority to this assistant, but we knew inherently, from both of us were business school graduates at the time, we knew inherently that to grow the business, we had to separate out the $500 an hour revenue generation tasks
Mm-hmm.
and the $10 an hour admin tasks.
Totally.
And so that was what Give Up Control is about. So we employed our first assistant 13 odd years ago now, 14 years ago. And today that first person that I employed is now, a shareholder in the business and has been here all that time. But essentially what we did there was we literally stood over his shoulder for the first 5 deals and said, this is how we do it. And he, again, is a commerce and honors graduate in commerce, very academically clever, didn't understand the business. We had to explain the business to him
Mm-hmm.
and the process. And part of it was having a process. Now, in a mortgage business, the beauty of it, the challenge after 18 years is that every client is still different. Every client has a different set of circumstances. In the dental world, I guess, if you're employing a dental hygienist as an example, the process that they're going to follow to do a scale and clean is going to be fairly structured every time, although every person's mouth is different.
Indeed. Yep.
Okay. And so that no different actually to the mortgage industry. The process of submitting a loan and following it up is exactly the same. It was just that each person's particular circumstance was slightly different. And so getting that across, that it wasn't each one was completely different and a completely new learning experience, that was the key to giving up control, was saying, what do? We give up control of the day-to-day tasks to release ourselves to do the high revenue generation tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we then become more productive. We give ourselves time to work, as they're famous saying about working on your business, not in your business.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what it allowed us to do. It allowed us to spend time thinking about how do we generate new business? How do we go out there and get new clients? Giving us time to be out there canvassing, seeing real estate agents, seeing potential referrer groups, because we weren't tied into the office to be submitting loans and following up on loans.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the things that, some of the work that I do with clients as well, we talk about the concept that making money is killing a business. And what I mean by that is if they don't give up control and they don't release themselves to be able to do those high-end tasks, you might make a few dollars here and there, but you're missing the much bigger picture and the much higher revenue opportunities, whether it's directly through the work that you do or, as you've indicated, through canvassing opportunities, developing partnerships, strategic alliances, and so on. And that's really where the money comes from. So again, I think it's a really good chapter. And ladies and gents, if you've just joined us, I'm having a conversation with Rael Bricker. You can find him at raelbricker.com, and he's been incredibly generous by offering a copy of his book to every listener of our show, and you can get that and download it at raelbricker.com/free book. And I'd really encourage you to go out and get a copy. When we spoke about your book off air as well, there was another chapter there that really piqued my interest, Rael. It's a great title, and it's chapter 5 in your book, and it's about business is about sales and in brackets, don't tell the marketing gurus. Tell me about that. What came up there?
Well, it's the same sort of thing. I would, over the years, speak to guys in the mortgage industry, in the financial planning industry, and then in the greater sense of any professionals, but started out there where I would talk to people and they would go, I don't sell. I'm going, well, of course you sell.
Yeah.
You're obviously in the business of sales, because if you're not generating sales, you're not generating revenue, and therefore you're on the way to going bankrupt.
Yep.
But what it was about the fact that when you talk, and now I'm sure you get in your business, because I get it every day, I get 72 emails from somebody telling me that my SEO needs some tweaking, and that they can write me a better website, and they can get me higher on the Google rankings and all these other things.
Or something about funnels these days is a big one as well.
And so there's all this noise happening out there. But fundamentally, it is about being able to sell. Now, if you're in a dental practice, the fact that somebody's come in and made an appointment with you is already, half the sale is done from that perspective.
Of course.
The question then becomes, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that dental teams tend to have the idea of the cross-sell down fairly well. But it is about sales. If your business, if you don't accept, no matter who you are, that you're in sales, no matter what business you're in, even though you might think you're not in sales, you're doomed to failure. The marketing gurus will tell us that you need to do all these other things around it. You need to have these oversized campaigns, and you need to spend money on now today. In the old days, advertising, now it's SEO, and now it's Facebook advertising and LinkedIn advertising. And those things are all good for lead generation. But at the end of the day, a lead is just a lead. You have to then follow them up. Now, a dental practice here in Perth that is run by a friend of mine, he's made a move towards moving away from advertising dental service, which is, the basics, I guess, to brighten your smile, teeth whitening, veneers, etc., and actually talks about that in his advertising on radio.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Again, he's shifted from, yes, that's part of his marketing, but at the end of the day, that is him selling his services. He's selling his value-add services, because there's no way that somebody's going to come in for teeth whitening to a dental practice, as an example, where he's still not going to go through the basics of, I need to actually check your teeth and make sure there's no holes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, Rael, as well. One of the things I talk about when it comes to sales is the post-sale sale, meaning that someone commits to spend money with you, you deliver the service, and then it's about continuing to keep that patient or that customer engaged and happy with your business. So you're constantly selling, in my mind, and you're constantly reminding people of the value that they're going to get by coming back and again and again. A lot of the work that we do in our business with dentists, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, is around customer retention, or in our case, patient retention.
Yeah.
And I think it's the thing that not many marketing people talk about, because you see, you've already mentioned in your inbox, it's all SEO, AdWords, Facebook ads, whatever, spend money, push the magic button and let it rain customers. But my view on that is, if we had every customer we'd ever done business with, imagine how big our business or practice would be. It'd be huge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so in the mortgage space and our financial planning practice that started in 2010, we do 6 to 8 newsletters a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously with everything that's gone on with the Royal Commission of late, with Reserve Bank, etc., we bring out more detailed newsletters when certain. So we have 2 types of communication with clients, and that's all about customer retention. Every one of them finishes with a call to action. And the call to action is, when did you last review your interest rates? When did you last review your insurance? It's a free service. Give us a call. So there's a call to action, a call to do something that may be triggered by a bank that we deal with has a special rate of 3.4%. Well, that would be fantastic, actually, if it was, but 3.69. If you think you might qualify, please follow up with us or give us a call, and we'll investigate it for you. So there's always a call to action.
Mm-hmm.
But a friend of mine was talking the other day, and he said to me that the whole point of marketing, and we were talking about LinkedIn, actually, and using social media. And he said, it is about building trust before the sale.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, a lot of these clients on our databases are clients who we've spoken to or dealt with in the past. So we have some level of trust with them already.
Mm-hmm.
They hopefully know, like, and trust us. At that point, we keep in contact with two different things. So we have reactive information. So today, if the Reserve Bank, it happens to be the first Tuesday of April, that we're recording this. So if the Reserve Bank of Australia decides to change interest rates today, then my staff and I will put out a newsletter to the database later in the day about the implications of the Reserve Bank decision. But there is a pipeline and there are funnels and all the things that are currently out there where we are developing set. And I do this, by the way, both as a mortgage in the mortgage business and as a speaker and consultant, so off two different businesses. Both of those have funnels and pipelines of useful information that's of a generic nature, that's not time-bound, and that goes out on two different funnels to obviously they're different client sets that we're talking to.
Of course.
And every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on their response to the previous one. So if they click through a link or open the email, then 2 to 3 weeks later, they get a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth or a 10th email. Those each run up to 26. So it's a year of 2 weekly emails. And those are all information-based.
Yeah.
But everyone has a call to action in it that says, if you're interested, please call us, or if you're interested or you want to pursue something, or you'd like to be part of my global study into culture, all these calls to action are at the end of that.
And so the lesson here, really, ladies and gents, is it's important to keep engaged with your patients. It's important to have a newsletter. It's important to be inviting patients back to the practice. It's important to make sure that you're regularly communicating, because the old Billy Joel song, it comes to mind, Tell Her About It. And in that song, he says, just because you haven't spoken for so long doesn't mean that her heart's getting fonder. It means that she's going away. And so it's the same with customers. You've got to maintain contact. You've got to remain close. And as Rael has said, it's about maintaining relevance, maintaining trust. Rael, I just want to just change gear for a second, because you spoke in some of the work I've read of yours around listing businesses on a couple of exchanges and equally growing your mortgage business to several $1 billion worth of transactions. So that's a fast-growing, scaling company. I wanted to ask you just really quickly about the scaling process from your perspective. What you learned, what were the pitfalls, and what did you do? We've got a lot of our clients who are in that process as well, and growth brings tremendous opportunity, but it also brings headaches and challenges that you may not have encountered before. What sort of challenges did you encounter in your rapid trajectory?
I mean, I guess the first one, and it was quite specific. Okay, so let me start with our education business in South Africa, because that was a completely different business. I make no bones about the fact that we were in the right place at the right time. We started a consultancy, because that's what 25-year-old MBA students do when they think they can teach the world how to run their businesses. And we started a consultancy in mid-1990.
Should have been a life coach too, mate.
6 months after the release of Nelson Mandela. At that time, about 3 years before the first democratic elections. But the unbanning of the ANC, the black nationalism coming to the fore in South Africa. And really, we were a little lost. We picked up 1 or 2 contracts as consultants, which was even more amazing. And then we were sort of suggested by the Marketing Institute at the time that we were so well qualified, why don't we start teaching their diploma course? So the Australian equivalent would have been a Cert 4 from TAFE. In South Africa, it was a different qualification, but it was that kind of equivalent. We then had no money, which was a second part of starting a business with no money. But we scaled up very quickly because we found people who would help us. We got family and friends involved on registration day who came and chucked in their hands the first few years. And then we had staff to do that. But it was a case of we acknowledged very early on that in order to grow, we needed to develop all the course materials. So that was being in control. And then as soon as we had developed them, we delivered the course once, we refined the course, and then we employed people. And so we chose our offices across the road from the university. So it was all these university academics that we could tap into who were happy to have a little job on the side for a few hours a week teaching at a private college. So that was the first part of the growth, was we acknowledged early on, without actually probably explicitly stating it, that we needed to rapidly scale or have the ability to scale. And that's why we chose our offices across the road from the university. So we had the scaling ability, being able to literally walk onto campus, knock on people's doors, say a statistics lecturer, and go, hey, would you like an extra few hours of work a week to come and teach statistics?
Yeah.
So that was the first sort of decision around the scaling rapidly. So that was in 1990. By 1992, we decided to open our first of our remote offices. And by 96, when the business was at its peak and we approached a small listed company to reverse into them and grow with them, we had some 4,000 students spread over 6 campuses around the country.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to scale, we were using technology at the time that was far more advanced than anyone else was using. That was the other thing that helped us, was technology. Yep. And it wasn't sophisticated technology. You know, we'd open an office down in Durban and Cape Town and a couple other small towns around the coast. And we had the ability to transfer the phones to our head office, which was manned. Now, unlike Australia, we were all in the same time zone, which did help a lot. So that meant that our staff in any of those remote offices could be out the office, could be interviewing potential students, could be doing other things, but the phones were always answered. We then did some weird stuff, and I talk about it in the book. How did we scale? So our adverts in Durban, which is one of the cities in South Africa, always said, please phone Debbie in our office, and gave a local number. Mm-hmm. When we got a call in our Johannesburg office because the person wasn't in the Durban office, and they said, hello, could I speak to Debbie? We knew they were originating from Durban because of the D in the name.
Got it.
So we didn't have call tracking, caller ID, any of those things available. We used the best technology we could to allow us to scale. So we had a staff in Johannesburg that could manage all of that, send out paperwork to people, and they got it 24 hours later. You know, the mail system was reasonably good in those days. So that was part of the scaling.
What went wrong? Where did you come unstuck? Because surely it can't have all been smooth sailing.
No, where did we come unstuck? I mean, it was interesting. What we found was that post-94, there was, with the first democratic elections, and given the fact that the universities were always hotbeds of political activity prior to 1990, but still post-1990, what we started finding was that the students themselves couldn't distinguish between the fact that they'd chosen, or their parents had chosen, for them to be at a private school, private college, as opposed to a government-run university.
Got it.
And so we started seeing from about 94 a lot of political activism within our students. You know, we demand. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a weird one when this is a private organization and you've chosen to be here.
Yes.
But it was the time in Africa.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, things fell apart when we did everything on a handshake. We weren't prepared to spend money on lawyers for employment contracts.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you would go and find an academic to lecture in a certain subject, and day one, there'd be a class of students sitting there and no lecturer, and you'd phone and they go, oh, yeah, I didn't feel like doing it, sorry.
Ah, great.
Maybe not even saying sorry. That was probably our biggest challenge.
Yeah.
But going up to never ask staff to do anything you wouldn't do, one of the other principles in the book, between Jonathan and I, the two partners, we could lecture every single subject that our college taught. Did we lecture it? No, we didn't.
But
could we? Yes, we could.
Yes.
And so that, again, was one of our insurance policies that we put into place, because like the dentist that you're working with that wants to go from being a practitioner to a business, if their dentist that they've employed doesn't arrive on a particular day, well, you're assuming the person who owns the practice can actually fill in if they have to.
Yeah.
And maybe not necessarily want to, but they can.
Yep.
And
exactly.
So the same principle, you know, I wouldn't own a dental practice because I'm a bit then held over a barrel by the staff I have to employ.
Yeah, indeed. You've got to be able to know the job, be able to do the job, but not necessarily have to do the job on a day-to-day basis.
Correct. And that's how you grow. So you asked me about the scaling. The ability to know that you can do the job if you have to, and that the staff know that, but you never hold it over their heads, makes them accountable to a certain standard because you know what that standard is. You know, I've seen people buy into businesses where they don't necessarily do the job or know how to do the job, and those are often doomed to failure.
Yeah, I know a couple of people that bought into a bakery and they're not bakers, and it's just been a tale of misery.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the chairman of Wesfarmers, which owns Bunnings, right?
Yeah.
I heard a story that he told where he still goes and walks through a store incognito once every couple of weeks. And that's done, you know, the famous stories of Walmart in the States, etc., where these chief executives have always done that. Maybe they're not necessarily serving the customers on the floor, but they are very much involved in seeing what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Rael, you've been incredibly generous with your time today, and I want to say thank you. There's been lots of wisdom. And ladies and gents, just once again, I'd really encourage you to head across to raelbricker.com and grab a copy of Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School. And you can get that by going to raelbricker.com/free book and download it. You can also get a hard copy, of course, from Amazon and the usual outlets. Rael, I want to just wrap up our conversation today with a couple of pieces of advice for someone listening to this podcast. If there was the gospel according to Rael, or one or two or three key points that you wanted to leave people with as they go on their own business journey, what do you think have been the one or two things that have helped you most in your business career and the things that you'd like to impart to the audience?
Okay. The 3 or 4 tips are that give up control to gain control. And that's just the first, and we've spoken about that a lot today.
Yeah.
Never asking your staff to do anything that you wouldn't do.
Yep.
And that applies to a whole lot of things. My favorite story is when the gents' toilets at our offices were really smelly, being tactful when I say that. And I got my PA to buy these nice smelling things that go in the urinals. The first day they arrived, I put on a rubber glove and went to put them in and showed all the male staff where the box was, where the gloves were, and what to do. I haven't had to do it again in 5 years.
Yeah, nice.
Because I was prepared to do it the first time around.
Yep.
One of those things is remember, the third point is to remember that you have to think outside the square in terms of marketing. And there's a whole chapter in the book on finding the blue ocean. But you don't necessarily have to be this blue ocean business. You can just do simple things. And the most expensive marketing is not always the best. So one of the best things my finance businesses ever did was we came up with a slogan that said, for clear vision of your financial future. And we printed that on cloths for cleaning glasses.
Yes.
Unrelated business. And it came up on those cloths looking like an eye chart for clear vision of your financial future. It has the 1-300 number on. It's very simple. They cost us 12 cents each, manufactured and delivered to us. And I get people 5 years later calling the 1-300 number and saying, I'm driving past your office. Can I pop in and get some more of those? And my natural response from my staff is, great. Why don't you meet with one of our consultants and review your finances at the same time? And so, it wasn't expensive marketing. It wasn't out there, but it's effective. And it was blue ocean at the time.
Yeah.
It was unique. And those are the sorts of things you need to look at in your own business.
Perfect. Rael, once again, as I said a moment ago, you've been incredibly generous, not just with your time today, but particularly with your knowledge, your insights, and your experience. This book, Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School, what I really like about it is it's practical. It's not academic theory. This is real world, in the trenches lessons. And I imagine these lessons have not always come easily. They've probably involved a little bit of bark coming off the knees along the way, as we've all experienced. And I salute you, my friend. I think it's a tremendous book. And ladies and gents, I'd really encourage you to grab yourself a copy. It's a good read. It's concise and it's pithy and it's punchy and it's got a lot of just gems in there for you. Rael, thank you so much for your time today, mate.
Thank you for your time, and it's been great to chat to you.
Yeah, let's do it again. And look, I'm looking forward to seeing what the second book looks like, mate. So when you've got that out and done and dusted, let's talk about it, because this one's so good. I can't wait to see what's coming next.
No problem. Thank you very much, and thank you for your time and your generosity.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.